Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Shaili Prasad. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Global Health and Social Responsibility at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to this, our fourth annual Quee and Peterson Lecture. This is our first online one. It carries on a rich tradition of important issues in global health. Please note, we are recording this session, and this will be available on our site tomorrow. We hold these Quee and Peterson lectures annually, and we've had experts in health and global health talk about important topics that affect all of us. In 2017, Dr. Jonathan Patz spoke about confronting the global climate crisis. In 2018, Larry Gostin asked us to imagine global health with justice. And in 2019, Dr. Dennis Carroll sounded the warning that many have done. The future is coming. Are we prepared? Now, I do not have to remind you about the most overwhelming news of this year, the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it. It has exposed fault lines in healthcare systems and re-emphasized the need for sound leadership. It would be negligent on my part if I do not mention the upcoming elections 8 days from now and how critical it is. It is in this context we have the 2020 annual Quee and Peterson Lecture today on the political determinants of health, specifically charting the path to health equity, a 2020 review of the political determinants of health. To lead off, we have a presentation by Dr. Daniel E. Dawes. Professor Dawes is a widely respected author, scholar, educator, and leader in health equity, social reform, and mental health. He's the executive director of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia, and a professor of health law, policy, and management. He's also the co-founder of the Health Equity Leadership and Exchange Network, aptly called HELEN, which is a nationwide network of over 2,000 governmental and non-governmental leaders and scholars focused on bolstering leadership and exchange of research, information, and solutions to advance evidence-based health equity-focused policies and programs. Professor Dawes' research focuses on the drivers of health inequities and particularly among under-resourced, vulnerable, and marginalized communities, most notably in the political determinants of health. He brings a forward-thinking, inclusive, and multidisciplinary approach to this. His two groundbreaking books, 150 Years of Obamacare and The Political Determinants of Health, have been received very well with critical acclaim and rave reviews. He's currently the principal investigator on 3 major projects intended to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations, including the establishment of a strategic network of national, state, territorial, tribal, and local organizations in the United States, known as the National COVID-19 Resiliency Network, and the development of a comprehensive data platform to track health inequities and the social and political determinants. Dr. Dawes?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Prasad, for that very generous introduction. I am delighted to join you all this evening and talk about health inequities, fruit of America's poisonous tree. We're going to look at the political determinants of health and understand how health inequities have become entrenched in our structures, our institutions, and our communities over time. A special thank you to the Center for Global Health and Social Responsibility. I am so honored to give this year's Quee and Peterson Global Health Lecture. So for many of us, we understand the implications of health inequities, but for too long, many racial and ethnic minorities and other vulnerable and marginalized groups have found themselves in a precarious situation. Their health, their lives, literally hanging in the balance. Many of them falling through the cracks of our health systems, our educational system, our human services system, housing, behavioral health, and employment systems, to name a few. They struggle to live in a society that has intentionally erected barrier after barrier, intended to weaken their bodies and hasten their deaths. For over 400 years in the United States, these groups have experienced inequities throughout the life course, from womb to tomb. The inequities in health status and in healthcare are widely documented. Today, we have over 7,000 peer-reviewed journal articles highlighting these inequities. from rural disparities all the way to racial and ethnic disparities, to disability-related disparities, as you can see from your screen. So today I want to start with a short story that I think makes the incredible case for why we must continue to push for health equity, not only in Minnesota, but in the United States. And why, with the privilege and the power that each of you have, that you must use it to advance the cause. It started with a headache in late March. Then came the body aches. At first, Shalandra Rollins' doctor thought that it was the flu. By April 7, 3 days after she was finally diagnosed with COVID-19, the 38-year-old teaching assistant who had 2 years earlier managed to beat the odds, having lacked health insurance at times in her life, working in low-paying jobs, experiencing limited access to care, working hard to get her associate's degree, told her mom that she was feeling winded. Within an hour, she was in an ambulance, conscious but struggling to breathe, bound for a hospital. An hour later, she was pronounced dead. Shalandra Rollins, a mother of 2, had a number of factors that put her at high risk of dying from COVID-19. Like her mother, she had diabetes. She was Black, with a low salary job and very few resources. To date, we've lost over 220,000 lives to COVID-19, and the majority of these individuals had an underlying health condition. We know that the underlying health conditions, such as cancer and asthma, obesity, heart disease, and other chronic diseases, strike disproportionately within communities of color and lower socioeconomic status communities. And as a result, these communities are at greater risk of COVID-19. The inequities that predate COVID did not suddenly appear, nor are they inapplicable. Minorities, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable communities still contend with neighborhoods that are largely devoid of necessary health protective and health sustaining resources. And they still contend with the political determinants or drivers that created, perpetuated, and exacerbated these health inequities. We know that these vulnerable populations die disproportionately each year, and it's costing us over $300 billion in the United States. But the one thing that we must always remember is that the nation's health is not an organic outcome. It's not a coincidence that certain groups of Americans experience higher premature death rates or poorer health outcomes than others. Why? Why is this happening? Well, today we've recognized from public health researchers that a variety of forces impact our health and determine the quality and the extent of our lives on this earth, including social, economic, behavioral health, healthcare, and genetic factors, among others. It is true that air pollution, climate change, toxic waste sites, unclean water, lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, unsafe, unsecure, and unstable housing, poor quality education, inaccessible transportation, and other factors play an outsized role in our overall health and well-being. They increase our stress, they expose us to harmful elements, and they limit our opportunities to thrive. These social determinants of health in particular play an outsized role in these human-made pre-existing inequities. But underlying each one is a political determinant that we can no longer ignore. Too often, we've stopped at the social drivers of inequities, failing to dig even further to see the depths of the problem and understand its root causes and distribution. And as a result, we miss the link between the social determinants of health and their political roots. This pandemic demonstrates the inconvenient and harsh truth about the impact of the social determinants of health and how collectively these determinants, right, significantly contribute to our society's health inequities. It shows the compounding effect of political determinants of health over personal responsibility. You see, because no matter how much African Americans, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Latinx Americans, Pacific Islander Americans, and lower socioeconomic status individuals try to act responsibly, there are always structural, institutional, interpersonal, and even intrapersonal obstacles that hinder them. Beneath these communities' notice are political determinants that have pulled and continue to pull strings that prevent them from achieving their optimal health and full potential. And so, is it any wonder that COVID-19 hasn't been striking all population groups equally? No, because our economic and social policies haven't been benefiting all equally. Think about it in this respect. Who's getting tested or who has been able to get tested? Who gets access to healthcare and the quality of care? Even accessing water, accessing food, all political determinants. Well, Shailendra's story, in effect, highlights how one political determinant after another resulted in a continual tightening of a chokehold on her community and the eventual disaster that brought to light the inequities plaguing it. High obesity rates, diabetes, maternal mortality, depression, and many other health issues can be firmly linked back to political action or inaction. By understanding the political determinants of health, their origins, their impact, and their interconnection with the social determinants of health, we will be better equipped to develop and implement actionable solutions to close the health gap. You see, what Shailendra's story shows us is that behind virtually every health disparity and subsequent death, especially during this time of COVID-19, there were specific and insidious political determinants of health that led to the person's premature death. For a moment, I want to paint the picture of the tree of health for you. Initially, you may notice this magnificent tree, the fruit on the tree, the individuals, or even the tombstones surrounding this tree. But actually, this picture is far more representative of what our society currently has to offer some of its most vulnerable people. The tree represents society. You see, there have always been co-laborers in the fight for health equity. And I know many of you, in fact, have been co-laborers who have tended to this tree. We have worked tirelessly to feed the tree evidence-based policies, programs, and practices with the hope that the tree would provide fruit that would benefit all of society. However, the reality is that there have been others who have been working overtime to supply the tree with that which would do it harm. These are the roots that are undergirded by racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and other deleterious motives. From the bottom of the tree's base all the way up and through to the ends of its branches, what is supplied to the tree is eventually multiplied by the tree. So now, due to the root causes of inequities, the fruit represents higher rates of diabetes, inaccessible, safe, and secure housing, a lack of nutritious food, and any other number of those outcomes that we know as the social determinants of health. And as that poisonous and sometimes rotted fruit falls to the ground, the tree that had the potential to provide life-giving nourishment to all who encountered it now only leaves death and destruction in its shadow from one generation to the next. But all is not lost. There is hope. I want you to imagine what could and should have been. You see, the roots of the tree, which anchors the tree and is supposed to absorb nutrients from the soil, represent the political determinants of health. And the detrimental factors that the tree's roots were absorbing include racism, sexism, classism, and many other evils. Every political and policy decision that is made feeds into the tree, yielding fruit which permeates throughout our society. But if the tree of health is rooted in health equity, the end result is a society that is nourished, cared for, and capable of achieving its full potential. You see, Shailendra's story is not just a truly tragic story. It's a reminder that her death was not only preventable, but downright avoidable if only she had been fed by a tree of health that bore life-sustaining fruit. So how did we get here? How did we get here? We're going to look at big P policy and little p policy, governmental policy and non-governmental policy for a moment, right? We know that inequality gets under our skin. and it leads to accelerated aging in our bodies, right? Or biological weathering, as Dr. Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan has coined. And it increases our rates of chronic diseases, as Dr. David Williams at Harvard T-Chan School of Public Health has noted, right? So think about it this way. Think about a drip of water, a constant drip of water on a block of cement, right? At first, we don't notice the impact that that drip of water is having on the cement block. But over time, what happens? It starts to wear away at the concrete. That's essentially what is happening in many Black and brown bodies in this country, in many individuals who have suffered intergenerational trauma from the beginning of this nation's history until today. So I want to take us back now. We understand that the social determinants of health, are these structural conditions in which we are born, we live, and we are educated and work in, right? Well, let's actually talk about how those structural conditions actually came to be. Let's go back to the 1600s. We know that Massachusetts became the first colony to legalize slavery, and other colonies followed suit. But as if that wasn't enough to keep down a group of individuals, Africans, right? African slaves in this country. No, these lawmakers, these policymakers then decided to create, to develop and implement and then enforce policies that would stifle their ability to address their social needs, essentially, right? So they enacted policies that denied Blacks and indigenous populations in this country from raising their own food, earning their own money, from learning to read and write, especially English. They prohibited them from going beyond a mile radius, right, to socialize with one another. They had to have passes in order to do so. Or if it was at nighttime, they had to carry lanterns, right? We know that there were a host of other policies, again, designed one after the other to keep these groups of individuals down. Well, throughout that century into the next and beyond, these policies were recycled one generation to the next. We know that in the era of Jim Crow, after there was an attempt to advance more equity-focused policies, although short-lived, Jim Crow reared its ugly head. And all of a sudden you saw again, policymakers at all levels influencing policies, creating policies that would again tighten the chokehold on these communities. We went into the 1900s where the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration enacted laws, one notably the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act, right? The HOLC, that intentionally discriminated against communities of color, that intentionally segregated these communities. And essentially what they did, as you can see from this screen, right, is the federal government sent individuals, property appraisers, into over 200 cities across the United States. They were charged with going into the neighborhoods in these cities and grading them an A, B, C, or D, as well as aligning a color code to that. As you can imagine, the neighborhoods that had an A were the most desirable. A B were still desirable. A C were less desirable or declining, and a red or D were neighborhoods or communities that they saw as hazardous. And which ones do you think were the red communities? They were primarily African-American communities, communities of color. So essentially then what happened after these reports were compiled, they were sent back to Washington, D.C., where the federal government used them to make policy determinations about who they would grant VA and FHA loans. So as if it weren't enough already that these communities had been starved of the resources that they need to thrive for generations, the federal government continued to disinvest in these communities, and the commercial interests then followed suit. The commercial interests said, well, you know what, if the federal government isn't investing in these, why should we, commercial banks, invest and give loans to these communities? Why should we as grocery chain operators invest in these communities? Or hospitals, clinics, and the like, right? It wasn't profitable. We know then afterwards that the country moved away from facially discriminatory policies, right? which on their face had explicitly discriminated against African Americans, indigenous, and other communities of color. And they then determined at that point that they would create policies that were facially neutral. So it didn't say that they were going to discriminate against Blacks, but the idea was that it had a disparate impact on these communities. So while it wasn't explicit, it was intentionally discriminatory, even though facially neutral. So think about, for many of the communities that you've ventured into, whether within the state of Minnesota or outside the state of Minnesota, across the United States, if you go into many Black communities, you will notice that there are major highways that run right through these neighborhoods, right? It's not that these neighborhoods were built around this infrastructure. No, instead, they were actually the authorization of policies that empowered policymakers at the state and local levels to go ahead and build these infrastructure. And these local and state policymakers determined that, you know what, as we are building it, let's build them in the areas of the country where they deem the people to have the least amount of power, the least amount of voice and privilege, right? And so is it any wonder when you go into these communities, you'll oftentimes see parking lots where houses and apartments once stood, right? You will see bus depots being built in these neighborhoods where they were never there before, but they were all an act of policy. So think about it. We know that the social determinants of health show us what plays an outsized role in our overall health. We know that communities of color tend to have the highest rates of asthma because they're breathing in the most polluted air in this country as a result of many of these highways, these toxic waste sites and factories, right? These bus depots. So they didn't just magically appear, they were actually authorized by policy. So again, we've got to connect the social determinants of health to the political decisions that authorize them in the first place. We know that throughout history now, what this has led to is a direct link to aggressive breast cancer prevalence among African-American women, right, who have triple negative breast cancer. We know that in these communities today, you can see the impact of these discriminatory policies by way of poverty taxes, right, in the form of higher payments for auto insurance and mortgage loans, lower property appraisals and the like. We know that it's led to deserts, food, pharmacy, and hospital deserts and swamps, making it more difficult for these communities to access the resources to improve their health and maintain health. And we've moved away now from this intentional redlining to what we call blue lining as a result of climate change, right? So as the sea levels are rising, as we see the manifestation of climate change in these communities, we know that many of these Black and brown communities often reside on higher elevated land in coastal communities, right? And because of the fact that policies had restricted their ability to purchase near the coastline, now we see that those who've been living near the coastline are moving in and pushing these communities again out of the communities that they have been living in for several generations. It's quite upsetting. What do we see? If you overlay then these red line maps, these blue line maps, and all of these policies, these political determinants of health, it is not surprising that we see the lowest life expectancy within communities of color in the communities, again, that were intentionally redlined by these acts of the federal, state, and local governments. Michael Marmot, Professor Michael Marmot, has often stated that life expectancy as a measure of health tells us a great deal about how we are doing as a society. But the inequalities in health tell us even more. So as we are moving forward into the next 20 years, as we're moving towards becoming a more diverse society, a racially pluralistic society, we rank 43rd today among nations in terms of our life expectancy. But if you disaggregated that by race and ethnicity, if all whites in this country were their own country, they would rank 50th in the world. If African Americans were their own country, they would rank 103rd in the world. And if all indigenous groups in this country were their own country, they would rank 143rd in the world. The bottom line is that we all could be doing better, and we must do better as we move forward in the next 20 years. Because as the Lancet has projected, Prior to COVID, we were expected to decline 21 points in terms of our rankings, or 21 places in terms of our rankings for life expectancy. Something to think about. Well, we know that policy, right, has been a driving force for many of these health inequities over the course of our nation's history. But the good news is there have also been individuals who have leveraged their power and privilege to push back on those political determinants of health inequities, fighting for policies that took an equity lens to them. So let's quickly talk about this. We know that in 1789, there was an attempt by abolitionists, by mental health reformers and others who were fighting to expand access to care, fighting for health equity essentially, to ask the federal government, our newly established government at that time, to pass legislation that would bolster the general welfare of everyone. And in there, they recruited a major political influencer, Benjamin Franklin. They begged Benjamin Franklin to lend his name to a petition that they wanted to send to the federal government. And in that petition, they begged the federal government to prohibit the separation of children from their mothers, the breakup of these enslaved families, to provide them access to healthcare, to education, to proper food and clothing and security. But if you think that we're in a contentious debate over health reform in America today, you can imagine what it was like. The policymakers at that time were livid with Benjamin Franklin, and they said, "How dare you, Benjamin, come back and come to us with this request when you know that we're just trying to get settled? How dare you?" The Senate decided they couldn't listen to him, but the House said, "You know what? We can't allow him to get away with this." So point by point, bullet by bullet, they made the case for why they couldn't stop the breakup of these enslaved families, why they couldn't abolish slavery, why they couldn't stop the separation of children from their mothers, why they couldn't provide access to healthcare and the like. And unfortunately, 3 weeks after their response, Benjamin Franklin died. And that was the first time in our nation's history in which the light of health equity had dimmed. It would take us 75 years later in this country before we were able to realize another opportunity to elevate health equity and prioritize it in public policy. They did that during the Civil War movement. They finally managed, after 2 years, to get a comprehensive policy addressing the social determinants of health. But there was a kicker. There was one provision in there that Abraham Lincoln and his supporters could not retain in the bill. And that was a provision to give access to medical care to these freed people, formerly enslaved people, and poor whites who were displaced as a result of the Civil War. That provision to provide medical care was so contentious that President Lincoln said, "Fine, we will compromise. I'll sign that into law." And surely he did, but 4 weeks later, he was assassinated. And his supporters decided they couldn't squander that crisis. They believed that the law that he had just signed actually gave them the authority to provide health care. Well, as we all know in this country, racism does not sleep. Sexism doesn't sleep. Homophobia and the like, they don't sleep. And they worked year after year for 7 years to undermine that health reform program. They succeeded on the 7th anniversary, and we know what happened after that. There was then an effort to then overturn all of these civil rights laws that were created afterwards. We know then what happened after that. It would take us 100 years before we would realize, again, these civil rights protections and expansion of health equity focused policies. But let me take us into the more immediate future with the last few minutes that I have. Initially the court had denied that there was a political driver for these inequities, or a political determinant that created the inequities that we saw in our society at the time. Obviously, health equity champions were able to collect that evidence and kept pushing to say, no, you have it wrong, because it was a political determinant that caused the fragmentation and these inequities in our society. Well, today, the US Supreme Court, while we've been distracted with the legislative and the executive branches of our government, the judicial branch has been quietly moving through all of these civil rights case law to chip away at the protections, at the health equity focused laws that we've managed to get from the civil rights movement. And here you can see that the court has been recently recycling the statement that Vestiges of past segregation by state decree do remain in our society. Past wrongs committed by the state and in its name are a stubborn fact of history, and stubborn facts of history linger and persist. But, they argue, though we cannot escape our history, neither must we overstate its consequences in fixing legal responsibilities. Here's why this is alarming, at least for 3 reasons, right? The court fails to take into account the evidence from a broad spectrum of research, demonstrating the lasting impact that these so-called vestiges of slavery and segregation and subsequent discrimination have on population groups. Secondly, it has a rippling effect into other case law at all levels of the judicial branch, right? Setting a precedent for other policies commissioned by other governmental bodies. And third, they are arbitrarily determining the point at which these vestiges of legally sanctioned discrimination cease to significantly impact certain communities. They're essentially arguing that after a certain amount of time, it doesn't matter anymore. Get over it. Well, here's why this should be troubling for all of us who are public health advocates, healthcare advocates in this country. You know, the court would rather view inequities as products of private choices or products of the social determinants, so they don't have constitutional implications or legally enforceable remedies, right? So if the inequity is a socially derived inequity, well, then the law doesn't have to step in, essentially. We can't force Black and brown and white people to love one another. They just naturally don't like one another, is the argument, right? Well, health equity advocates, those of us who understand the social determinants of health, those of us who continue to make the case that inequities are solely socially derived, and fail to show the political connection, will only bolster the US Supreme Court's viewpoint, thus weakening legal protections to check these structural and these institutional forms of discrimination, as well as deny legal remedies to those who've been impacted by inequities over time. So let's quickly talk about how we can leverage the political determinants of health. You know, we are in a very serious pandemic. And we know that COVID-19, much like past pandemics, you know, negatively impacts and further disadvantages, you know, vulnerable populations, right? Lower socioeconomic status groups, racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and immigrant communities the worst. Review after review of studies show it's the same group of people on the downside of advantage and opportunity. Well, you've seen that during certain crises, we've been able to realize an equitable policy response, but never before in a pandemic. And I'm hoping that, you know, through our newfound lens, when we look at these drivers of inequities, through the political determinants of health lens, perhaps with the evidence of which levers have been pushed and pulled and which ones have worked and haven't, we might be able to stem the tide of this pandemic in the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. So this is a very wonky slide. I obviously don't have time to go through it, but the idea here is that in this country, to advance health equity, you know, we have always had to demonstrate the value of investing in change. We have to understand the disquieting and harsh truth that the political determinants of health inequities have rarely been addressed unless their reduction or elimination served other purposes. So as you can see, there's a host of structural, institutional, and other forms of obstacles that we have to overcome, right, in order to effect the changes in policy. And in order to do so, we have found that in this country, you have to align that with a commercial interest and a government investment value. I hope during the question and answer period, we'll be able to get into that. But let me close with 5 things that we can do right now to elevate health equity in America. First, we have to engage in the very tough conversations around race, place, and class, and advocate for a full commitment to tackling health inequities upstream in all areas. We have to work upstream further than the social determinants of health and go to the political drivers of these health inequities, right? Connecting the social determinants to their political roots, understanding when they are at play. We have to research the history of our communities. We're such a transient society. And as we move around and we get into a new neighborhood, it is so easy to judge the people who are living there. But we must address the past policies and programs at all levels that created, perpetuated, and exacerbated these inequities, remembering that in this country, exclusion has always been easier to realize in policy than inclusion. Then we have to strengthen our networks and engagement. We become complacent over time. We must strengthen those networks and engagement. We must understand that it's not just by voting, but it's a continual process. And we must understand that health inequities, right, or health equity begins and it ends with the political determinants of health. I think the good news is that these structural barriers and the resulting inequities aren't permanent, but they're going to take greater action and collective agreement from all of us to stomp out these inequities in our society. Let me leave you with this thought from a dear friend and mentor of mine, Dr. David Satcher, who was our 16th US Surgeon General, where he reminds us that we need, even more so than ever before, leaders who care enough. They care about these issues. They know enough. They have studied, right, these drivers, these determinants of health inequities. They have the courage to do enough, and they persevere until the job is done. And I hope that we have such individuals who have been watching this evening. Thank you all again for the privilege of your time. I look forward to collaborating with you and harnessing that power of collaboration to effect the changes that will help our state, the state of Minnesota, and of course, our country, realize a more healthy, equitable, and inclusive society.
Thank you, Dr. Dawes. That was energizing. I really appreciate the information you've given, particularly what you mentioned is a wonky background behind it. Before I go to our next speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that there is a Q&A box down in your screen. Please type in your questions in there, and I will moderate the Q&A session after our presentations. It's now my particular privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ilana Kickbush. Professor Kickbush is a member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board established by the WHO and the World Bank. She's the founding director and chair of the advisory group of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. She's joining us from Geneva right now. Dr. Kickbush acts as council chair to the World Health Summit in Berlin, which is going on right now. She's been involved in German G7 and G20 activities relating to global health and chaired the International Advisory Board for the development of the German Global Health Strategy. She initiated the @WGH 300 list of women leaders in global health. She's a co-chair of a Lancet Commission on Governing Health Futures 2030, Growing Up in a Digital World. Professor Kickbush has had a very distinguished career with the WHO and was the director of the Global Health Division at Yale University School of Public Health, and was also responsible for the first major Fulbright program on global health. She's published extensively and received many prizes and recognition, including the Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. Professor Kickbush, thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I mean, what a hard act to follow. That was a fantastic presentation. And for those of us who have been in this business of the determinants of health, it is in a way gratifying that through academic work, through many social movements, through political debate, the notion of the political determinants of health is coming to the fore in a whole range of ways at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. And you have asked me to speak a little bit about those dimensions at the global level that we confront, and in what way they might be addressed as we try to go further. And of course, just as at the national level and at the local level, the political determinants, those political roots, as we were just told, have become more visible. They've been very hidden underground with all kinds of mud and leaves and whatever thrown over it. And COVID has blown that away. And now suddenly we very, very starkly see what those roots have brought with them and how long those roots have been there, and maybe even how far they have now reached into our societies. So, you know, we can't just cut them. It really needs a tremendous effort. So if I do go to the global level, of course, public health and global health have always been political, always, from the very start. I come from a country, originally Germany. Rudolf Virchow said, you know, politics is medicine at a larger scale, basically, when he was talking about inequalities from the typhus epidemic in Silesia. So we've always sort of known this, but strangely enough, also in the global arena, this got buried among many of the leaves. And I think it still needs an analysis of when and why this happened. And I think much of it actually did happen around 1990 or so, after a number of people thought we'd reached the end of history and we were all wanting to do the same thing. But very clearly, everything we've seen since then has actually moved in the other direction. So we're only now also starting to look more systematically at the political determinants of health in the global arena again. And here, not only in relation to inequity, where I could, you know, follow many of the points you've raised exactly the same way at the global level, but also how political choices and politics have played out in relation to multilateralism and to regime type of countries. And we partly also see that through this new set of words that we have, vaccine nationalism, and everything that it stands for. So it's very clear in global health and in global governance that there is uneven power relations. There is just no question about that. And they play out in very, very different ways. They have very different political roots, actually even going back to the way the multilateral system was built after the Second World War. And as thankful as we are to the United States for having pushed the building of the United Nations, at the same time, of course, the United States made it quite obvious that they wanted to continue to call the shots in that international system, or what was then called the liberal world order that seems to be crumbling away. So we also historically, just like you did for the national level, we do have to go back historically, exploring those roots and what still is expressed there. Because of course, the roots of the power relationships in global health also go back to colonialism. They go back to the Second World War. They go back to a whole range of global North, global South differences and power relations that we continuously have to analyze, that are very different forms of exploitation, all of which have then their result in social determinants of health and high rates of mortality and disease. So on the one hand, in the international sphere, we have this power imbalance between the global North and the global South, for simplicity's sake. But we also have it between institutions that were created, between the financial institutions and countries. And just think back to the whole structural adjustment policies of the World Bank, of the International Monetary Fund, also the changes in Eastern Europe and Russia after the opening in 1989, where existing infrastructures for health and public health were explicitly destroyed and privatized, because the policy was, there should not be public money in investment in these areas. The state was supposed to be kept weak. And that, of course, is built on an American model that you have very much described to us, that health should be seen as a personal, as a private matter, and not as a public good and as a public responsibility of the state. But not only between these institutions and countries, who were often, on the weekend, it was also between these institutions and other international institutions. There have, for a long time also been conflicts between the policies of the World Bank and the IMF, and for example, in the 1960s and 70s of the WHO, in the 1990s of the World Bank and WHO. There is less conflict right now, but we also see, depending who has the majority in which organizations, and WHO tends to be, a universal organization with 194 member states, where countries of the South can vote at least against something. But of course, the construct of the international development organizations, the development banks, etc., has the global North in the lead with their interests. And similar things are played out if you see the power relationship between the World Trade Organization and the WHO, for example, where intellectual property, which is so important for pharmaceuticals, now for the global vaccine against COVID-19, where these intellectual property rules are made in a different kind of organization, where the global North has a much stronger power base. And it'll be very interesting to see right now, South Africa and India have asked for, or have demanded, I should say, TRIPS waivers, intellectual property waivers for vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics related to COVID-19 at the World Trade Organization. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, and how it plays out if the World Trade Organization were to get an African head. The elections are just going on. So we have those power relationships, and then we have the power relationships between what's supposed to be doing good and the countries that need financial and other support. So we have in global health a model of ODA, of development support, which is also usually linked to all kinds of conditionalities. We have major charities and philanthropies that actually set agendas rather than that countries themselves can set agendas. And there is no way really where at the global level one has really found a solution for common goods or global public goods, or for some kind of more regular redistribution that is not based on a charity model, but that is actually based on rights. Just like, some of the European welfare states have redistributions in terms of social security, we have not moved into those kind of models at the global level. So, there's that power, that big power imbalance. And then, of course, there's the influence of what we call the commercial determinants of health. You had them on your model as well. So we have the interests of major industries, particularly, let's take the tobacco industry, on global health, on the way decisions are taken. And of course, if you take the World Health Organization, these industries do not have, the direct vote. But I can definitely tell you, I've worked in the WHO for a long time, that there is no shortage of countries who will make themselves the mouthpiece of central industries and commercial interests that they have in their countries. So it's absolutely critical in this global power game and interest game that we have a strong civil society that actually speaks out and takes things forward. So I think, there we can find a mirror image in a way of what we have heard for the national level. But what we also see now is a range of the other political determinants of health that are linked to ideologies, that are linked to system types. We are now being confronted with having to better understand, how do democracies act in global health and different types of democracies, and how do autocracies act? And you will have seen the first analyses coming out. Who is more successful in actually managing the COVID-19 agenda? We also see that countries are coming together in a new way, and partly led by the United States, to actually chip away at values and agreements that we had managed to get in global health. Particularly popular are everything related to women's rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And you will know that the United States just created an alliance of the willing with some of the most autocratic countries in the world against abortion. So you can see that rights, we are, celebrating Beijing and the accord found there, that they are being chipped away. We see certain countries moving out, and you know that the United States has moved out of a number of multilateral agreements and organizations. It has also stated it would move out of the WHO. So people linked to global health are really wondering and hoping, what is going to happen in your elections on the 3rd of November. It's your election is going to partly decide on the future of the World Health Organization. So this interface of national political determinants and global political determinants is absolutely critical to keep in mind. And then one must add, because of different systems, we see some of these systems like China actually participating significantly in the multilateral system. Actually, there's no country that heads as many international organizations as China. But the strategy, again, is to chip away and get a redefinition of the values that we hold dear in this global system. So you can see that this other level of politics, really as politics, is incredibly important, as ideology is very important. If I look back, when we had the Cold War, I still worked in WHO then. There was always this notion of what kind of health systems do countries want. And the USSR and everyone related to it were actually pushing for state-based health systems. And the other side, the West, led by the United States, clearly saw this as, a private sector initiative, as personal choice initiatives, also around, NCDs, it was always about choice. People should have choice. It was about individualistic approaches rather than social solidarity approaches. And to some extent, that debate has come back into the discussions again. I'll end with with two aspects. One is also a very political one. We see that health, or within health and health organizations, proxy political issues are being played out. So in COVID-19, the geopolitical fights, if I can call it that, between China and the United States are being played out, and WHO is used as what would you say in English? It's being beaten up on behalf of something else. But we have other debates that, are taken into the health arena to test out countries, but through that actually damage the health debate. Think of the Taiwan debate. WHO has no choice over whether Taiwan is a member or not. It needs to be discussed totally somewhere else. Or take the fact that the United States is destroying discussions in the G7, G20, the UN Security Council, because it refuses every resolution where the World Health Organization is even mentioned. So, you see a crumbling, and a sort of proxy war kind of thing going on that is very, very dangerous to global health. So I think, and I would end with that, we need to be much more aware of how political global health is. The Director General of the WHO always says health is a political choice. And he means that, he knows that. He was a foreign minister, he knows all about power. But the critical thing is not to say there shouldn't be politics in global health. You can't have no politics in health. I mean, your example also showed that clearly. It's the question who wins those politics. It's the question of the power balance. And therefore, one of the big challenges in global health governance right now is what are the mechanisms, the structures, etc., the principles that allow an organization like WHO to navigate the politics and to find a way to actually come back to a productive form of multilateralism that also gives the global south a much larger voice and literally more power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kickbush. That was wonderful. Despite the rather dreary outlook in some ways, I think I completely agree. We need to be part of this process anyway. Now I'd like to introduce our own Dean Bloomberg. Professor Laura Bloomberg is a professor and dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. In this role, Dr. Bloomberg has led the global expansion of the school, established a national pathway program for college students underrepresented in public affairs programs, launched an internationally focused Master of Human Rights degree, and developed the Mandela Washington Fellowship Program to support young leaders from countries across Africa. In 2019, Dr. Bloomberg was elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA, not that NAPA. Dr. Bloomberg's academic research focuses on community-based leadership, program evaluation, and elementary secondary educational policy. She is the co-editor of award-winning books, Public Value and Public Administration, and Creating Public Value in Practice, Advancing the Common Good in a Multi-Sector, Shared Power, No One Wholly in Charge World. Dr. Bloomberg is board chair of the Nationwide Public Policy and International Affairs Program, PPIA, to promote full participation of underrepresented groups in public service, and the 2020-2021 president of the National Network of Schools of Public Policy, Affairs and Administration, NASPA, considered the gold standard in public service education. Dr. Bloomberg.
Thank you very much. And Professor Dawes and Dr. Kickbush, I am so inspired by your words, and I have so many things I'd like to comment on and extend, but in the interest of time, I know we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll keep my comments brief and just say thank you for all that you said. I do have to comment on one piece though. Professor Dawes, when you shared with us the photo, that beautiful photo of Shalonda Rollins, I don't think I will, or anybody watching this will soon get that image, that haunting image out of our heads. It makes me think about something Audre Lorde said in the middle of the last century. I've been reading a lot of her work for inspiration. This is a Black feminist civil rights activist, and she famously and very simply said something that is so poignantly true right now. And she said, there really are no single issues because we do not lead single issue lives. And it's that photo is just such a haunting reminder of that. So thank you. In the public policy sphere, when we think about the political determinants of health, we think a lot, we're policy wonks. So we parse a lot of data, we look at things from a lot of different analytic angles. We think a lot about the capacity and the will. Where do we have the capacity to do something and where do we have the will to do something? Increasingly, in some of the books that I've published recently that Dr. Prasad referenced, we talk also about the importance of adding empathy to that. Where do we have the empathy? So I could look at some of the policies, the redlining policies, for instance, that you mentioned in Minnesota and think that they actually the things that disproportionately have harmed others have disproportionately benefited me as an individual, middle-class, white woman raised in America. If I look at that way, I lose sight of the fact that our destinies are inextricably linked with each other's, and I must care deeply. We must collectively care deeply. Lila Watson from Australia said this so beautifully when she says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together. And that's where I think we are. So when Dr. Kickbush talks about multilateral systems and institutions, we've got to think about it in that way. I will say candidly, I don't think we've done that well at all in the United States of America, and we must do a better job. I'd like to share just a couple of slides that will put in perspective. This is not specific to health, but it is specific to our politics in this country. And as you both referenced, we all might know we have an election coming up a week from tomorrow, although a disproportionate number of people have already voted. But here's some realities about where we are politically in this country, and it has such implications for who we are in the world. This slide is just simply a look at how people who identified as Democrats and or Republicans in the United States viewed people from the other party over time. So it starts in about 1975. And you can see, obviously, we always view our own party from a political perspective more favorably, or we have more warm things to say about the politics of people from our own party than the other. That's not surprising. What is alarming and something that we should pay close attention to is that we have never been as divided. Now, we can talk about far left Democrats and crazy far right Republicans, and this isn't nuanced. These data aren't nuanced in that way, but just in general, we have not in the last quarter of a century been further apart in terms of how we view the other. And that has huge implications for the kinds of trust that we have in our democracy. So as Dr. Kickbush is talking about how our democracy is dealing with the pandemic versus autocracies, one of the things we need to think about is how together are we as a democracy in terms of getting things done. If we look at this next slide, we can also think about the ways in which our politics impact how we trust the institutions that we charge with doing work. So I apologize that this is rather small, but what this data shows us is, again, from about 1974-75 until just before, well, this one's just 1974. The next slide will show you the other one. But the kinds of institutions that drive our democracy, law, public health, education, medicine, science, there were really only two institutions that fell outside of a common line, meaning that Republicans and Democrats had about the same level of trust in most of these institutions. The only outliers in 1974 were labor. Democrats tended to think that labor as an institution was more trustworthy than Republicans did, and Republicans thought business was more trustworthy than Democrats thought it was. So fast forward to about 2014 to 2016, just before our last election, and in this next slide, you will see how this has shifted. Now, if we look what's outside of the standard error lines, we see an enormous number of institutions that are held in distrust by members of the other party. So Democrats disproportionately trust the press, labor, TV news, K-12 education, and higher education. Far more so, statistically significantly more so than Republicans. Conversely, Republicans tend to trust business, religion, and the military significantly more than do Democrats. One of the things that is particularly alarming to me is if you look at towards the right, just to the right of the higher ed circle, in case you can't read it, science is dangerously close to falling outside of the standard error line, saying that it is trusted significantly more by Democrats than by Republicans. That is an alarming thing when we think about the reality in which our democracy is trying to operate and in which we are seeking to address the political determinants of health. So I mention these because I think that there's real significance to how we think about this as citizens. Certainly, we need to vote. If we haven't already in this country, if you haven't voted yet, you have to have a plan in place now to vote either before Tuesday or by Tuesday. It's absolutely imperative that we do that. Our democracy depends on so much more than that from us. So Professor Dawes listed 5 things we could do to address the political determinants of health, I would also think that we need to be civically engaged generally as individuals. So that's the last slide. If you want to stop sharing the screen now. I know that these things are heavy when we think about the implications that they have for how we address multilateral institutions, and yet there are things that we know from looking at the ways in which America has engaged with the world in the past that really make a difference, and we as citizens can impact. Historians will tell us that in America's best eras, not that we've had great eras always, but when we have engaged most productively and most affirmatively with the world through the WHO, through the FAO, through the UN, it is when we have advanced a perspective of humility, curiosity, and empathy. And so when I think about the capacity and will to address the social determinants of health, I also think about our ability as a country, as a political entity, and as a democracy in advancing this work with a level of humility, curiosity, and empathy. And some of the policies that we've seen recently are not that. And we've got to have the courage, we've got to have the will to stand up against some of those policies and say, there's a better way forward in terms of who we are as a people and as a democracy. So I will leave it there and happily answer any questions about that.
Dr. Bloomberg, you always bring that smile on my face because of that. Yes, we have this positive energy coming through. I'm going to transition us to the Q&A session. And I'm going to start with a question to Dr. Kickbush. And to set the stage, Dr. Kickbush, one of the interesting things that we have noticed is a lot of people look at global health engagement in the US as going on a short-term medical mission. And this is something that as a center, we've been in the midst of, we've been a big part of what's called the Brochet Declaration about the ethics of short-term medical mission. So even in this, the question here is more about participation in international institutions. Would that be by decreasing your influence? Because a lot of times when you participate in international influence, particularly the way you mentioned about the politics behind it, about exerting your influence over larger bodies, how could countries participate in international influence by decreasing their own specific power?
Well, multilateralism was put in place so that countries share their power, that they share their power for certain common problems that all countries face. Let's take COVID-19 right now, that they act jointly on solutions, and that those that have more, if I can call it that, are supportive of those that have less. It's as simple as that. Now, the minute you then translate this into, I want to use the multilateral system to forward only my power or my interest, there can be points in time where that is helpful in the global system. If you bring a lot of money to the table, like the United States has done, and says, we will decide to eradicate polio together with other partners. And as you know, the United States is one of the key funders of the polio eradication initiative. So in many cases, countries with money in their pockets or large American foundations have come and said, we want to resolve this issue, and therefore we will pay for it, and therefore we gain international prestige, we gain international friends, we can build alliances in international bodies. And, you get this difference, and I've written about it, where the United States has been in the past, and we will see, what happens in the future, an incredibly important partner with its science, its innovative people. Just think of the eradication of smallpox. The American leaders there, the American leaders in the eradication of polio, I could name you, so many fantastic people, Dean Henderson, etc. It's a list this large. And of course, Dr. Satcher was, a tremendous supporter of global health issues. And I was also able to meet him in that context. And the United States, the LGBTQ agenda was pushed by the United States in the WHO under the Obama administration. It actually used its power to say, look, we have to look at gender differently. Now the administration changes and the approach changes. So I think, it is this, when do we want to come together as one? And when do we want to use our power and our money for positioning ourselves, other interests, and then being able to exert power on these countries? And of course, one of the ways some countries are using this is you look at debts, you look at debt relief, you look at the enormous amount of debt, for example, African countries have with China and with the international system. And, the United States was not agreeable they were agreeable to debt relief, but not to ending debt for the African countries, for annulling debt. Is that what you say? So I think, those are the kind of things that we have to look into. But multilateralism is to come together to solve common problems and to do that jointly. And everyone brings to the table what they have. And those that have more must bring more to the table.
Thank you, Professor Kickbush. We've had a series of questions that seem to be an interplay between capitalism, universal healthcare, and healthcare systems. So, Dr. Dawes, would it be possible for us to achieve equity without a universal healthcare system? And is the current model of a capitalistic approach towards healthcare the main or part of the problem?
So that's a great question. And I think what we have seen in this country is that in order to advance health equity, and in order to advance these health reforms, we've usually had to align them with this commercial interest and a government investment value, right? So this commercial interest being how palatable is what you are advancing to the commercial side of business, because this is a capitalistic society. And no policies have been able, health equity focused policies, have been able to get passed into law and then of course implemented into law unless there was some alignment there. So you have to show in this country the value of investing in change, essentially. What's in it for these commercial interests? What's in it for the government? If you're not able to do that, then your policy agenda will never see the light of day at that federal level, at least, right? I know at local levels, at state levels, that moral argument has resonated. But if you don't align it with these interests, these commercial interests, as we discussed earlier, then I'm afraid the chances of success are very limited. I don't know of one major health policy, even including the civil rights legislation in this country in the 1960s, none of those would have passed if they didn't align with that commercial interest, right? To show that segregation was extremely costly from a business standpoint. So if you can show that, you will do, incredibly well. If you take Los Angeles, for instance, after the Rodney King beatings, there was this effort by public health leaders in that city, in South LA, who were tired of having a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, of having these food swamps, right? With all these fast food restaurants plaguing their neighborhoods. And they tried so hard to pass a moratorium, but they'd never really appreciated the lobbying power that these commercial interests were going to throw at them. And I think it came quite as a surprise just to how much so these restaurants will continue to fight to keep the status quo. Well, eventually they did succeed after years and years of trying, but unfortunately, those neighborhoods, that neighborhood, South LA, never got to see increases in fresh fruits and vegetables, right, in healthier options. Why? Because while they were fighting to stop these fast food joints from continuing to open up new restaurants, they weren't thinking about how they might be able to incentivize, right, using the power of the government there, incentivize these business leaders to come in and offer those healthier options. That was their downfall in that respect. So I do think you are right. When you think about neoliberalism, you think about all these concepts, about where we're going in terms of capitalism. it has been part of the problem. But I don't think health equity advocates have really understood these levers that have been pulled and pushed over time to advance the cause in this country at the federal level. Until we do so, I'm afraid we won't see much success. And you have to keep in mind, when you think about 1998, we were spending $1.35 billion on lobbying. Right up to the point when we were negotiating the ACA, you knew that these forces were concerned about what this Obamacare law would entail, right? The Affordable Care Act. You saw it triple, or these healthcare stakeholders tripling their investments in lobbying to ensure that it wouldn't do too much disruption in our healthcare society. So these are all different things that we have to think about very strategically as we try to push for these health equity focused policies.
Thank you. Dr. Kickbush?
Yes, I just want to underline that it's very important to see we have different types of democracies, and we have different types of capitalism. Because, if you do look at Europe, some of the countries with some of the best universal health coverage in the Nordic countries, I would add also Germany and Switzerland, etc., are very rich countries, are very capitalist countries. Talk to our activists in those countries, German pharmaceutical industry or whatever. And yet, through a certain historical trajectory, they have been able to build systems that ensure social security for their population. So I just want to say, I can't see in the short term that any of these systems would work for the US. I agree with you fully. But that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, is that it's not just capitalism per se. It is, you have different capitalist models where actually some capitalist countries have said, if we invest in and have our state ensure this amount of social security, and just see the responses to COVID-19 right now, where if you live in Germany or Switzerland or some of the Nordic countries, your social security is much more insured than in the United States, your furlough payments and all those kinds of things. And that, of course, takes us back also to Laura's point about trust, and trust in government, and trust in what part of government. And so at least in some of these countries, we don't see that enormous divisiveness yet that you have in your countries, even though we've started to see it. Look at Poland, for example, which has become such a divisive country along the lines of the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Kickbush. I was reminded of a similar argument in the climate discussion, how investing in good climate policies is actually capitalistically a better model than what we are looking at right now. Dr. Bloomberg, a couple of questions, and there's two parts. One is your graph of how the Democrats and Republicans are trusting different spheres here. First part of the question is, how do we bring them together? And the second part of the question, I know you were expecting that question. The second part of the question is, how do we get people who are underprivileged, under-resourced at the table in all of these policy discussions, including people who are working in communities, public health folks, physicians, and others at the level of the policy discussions? How can they be at the table too?
Wow, lots of answers to that. Let me take that last part first. We all look at the world through the lens that we have, and one of the lenses I have is to think about leadership and scholarship in higher education. I spent my entire morning talking with people about how it is that we are going to diversify the leadership and the professoriate within our field, and it is an imperative. I also think about this very carefully when I'm looking at the makeup of Congress or any state legislature. And, I speak again as a white woman when 23% of the higher house of Minnesota is represented by women. There's a basic question about whether women's health is ever going to be a top priority agenda item, you know. So we have to think about all of those things together. That is a part of what we must do. But let me say also something about the balance of capacity and will, because it also speaks to this question about healthcare and the markets. It's always an equation between what we know and what is our capacity to have, what is our will to do something. And when we bring that line closer together, the equation between capacity and will changes. We need a little, well, we always need the will to change, but we have a lot more grace period with will and a lot more trust in capacity when we trust each other a little bit more. So bringing that first graph together a little bit more is fundamental. And a huge part of that, I believe, and now this is not evidence-based, this is the world according to Laura from my perch, is a level of curiosity. We are really, as citizens in this country right now, pretty steeped in certainty. And a little bit of curiosity about learning about people, it would take us a long way. So that I think is a part of it. It sounds rather simplistic. And I am not, I draw the line. We all draw our lines. I draw the line at wanting to learn more about white supremacists. Really don't want to. Just not, but within the bandwidth of why is it that farmers have moved so far to the right and felt so underrepresented by the left when we are in this state, in Minnesota, we are, our history of the Democratic Party is the DFL, Democratic Farmer Labor. Why is it that that's happened? I've got to approach that with a level of curiosity, not certainty, if I'm going to bring the two lines of that graph closer together.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you for last comments, but if you can, I see a question from Dr. Phil Peterson here. What about the moral determinants of health? What is the right thing to do? So, Dr. Doss, I'm going to start with you there.
Sure. So, you know, I talk about that at the federal level of our government. And what I have seen as far as the evidence and using that as a strategy, right? I do agree that, you know, our policies reflect our values. And I know the great Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota talked about how, you know, these policies that we enact are really a reflection. They mirror, you know, our values at the time, a reflection of what to expect into the future. Well, every single time that folks have used that moral argument, you know, to justify pushing a health equity agenda in the United States, they can do so till their tongues bleed, okay? But it will not resonate at that level. It has never resonated at that level. You could talk about the number of people who are sick and dying. We have done that for a number of years. In fact, when I was working on the Affordable Care Act, we were using that moral argument, thinking truly, when people learn that there are 83,000, you know, people dying each year owing to disparities in health status, surely that's going to be enough for us to continue pushing this health equity agenda into health reform law. But it wasn't. In fact, it fell on deaf ears, essentially, right? Folks were just ignoring us. And it wasn't until we went back and looked at the arguments that resonated that we realized, oh my goodness, yeah, you know what, we're wasting our time at this level with that moral argument. It is important. You have folks like Congressman John Lewis who refuse to advance an argument tied to an economic or national security interest argument. And you will have them who will push, you know, with that moral argument. But for the most part, in order to get these policies over the finish line, it's always been you always had to tie it to that economic and national security argument. So the moral argument personally resonates with me, but for the majority of our lawmakers at that federal level, it has never equated to actually realizing health equity focused policies.
Thank you for that. Dr. Kickbush?
Well, I would like to highlight this link between what is happening at the national level and how that reflects at the global level, and how we particularly see that reflect in relation to COVID-19. Some of you might have seen we've just published a small compendium in the BMJ on democracy and health, together with Tom Boyke from the Council on Foreign Relations. And we've tried to look at some of these factors. And since then, VDEM, this important research project in Gothenburg in Sweden, has come up with its new figures. And it shows what they call certainly the most dramatic shift in an established democracy. And with that, they mean the move to the right. And I consciously say that, the move to the right of the American Republican Party. And it shows, you know, the company, at least according to their data, that this means that you are in. And they raise this very, very important notion, is that the Institute has found the decline in democratic traits has accelerated around the world. And for the first time in this century, autocracies are in the majority, holding power in 92 countries, home to 54% of the global population. So when just, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we actually saw democracies increase and a commitment to multilateralism increase, we see a different trend right now. And that reflects itself in COVID, because also the most recent work by Tom Boyke has shown that countries with low government trust, your point, Laura, countries with low government trust have performed worse in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they are performing more badly in terms of international solidarity, also because they are so overpressured with what is happening in their own country. So I think in terms of political determinants of health, I guess in the kind of global world we are now, we can no longer see the individual developments in individual countries separate from what is happening in relation to global solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bloomberg?
Oh, do I get another last word? I was looking at the time. I just completely agree with all that was said right here. I just want to take this moment to say something that's very US specific, but it's the kind of thing that, to this point about autocracies, that I find very chilling. It might have gone without notice last week because it's kind of a wonky bureaucratic thing, but there was an executive order issued by our US administration that essentially says, in shorthand, a hugely large percentage of our federal government employees could become at-will employees. That's what happens when you begin to see the fundamental eroding of a democracy, when the bureaucracy doesn't have power or protection from political decision-making. You begin a very slippery slope and a huge erosion. That, of all of the executive orders that have come out that have kind of alarmed me in the last 3 months, that may be the most chilling. And to Dr. Kickbush's point, I think we all have to be vigilant that when we don't have enough trust, this is what can happen, and it will harm all of us. That's a heavy place to end, but there's something we can do about it.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. Thank you all. Thank you for the privilege of being part of this discussion. I'm so intellectually stimulated despite all the negative news. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this. I want to especially thank Dr. Paul Quee and Dr. Phil Peterson, after whom this lectureship has been named. As long-standing leaders within our global health community and as the founders of our center, they built this platform we are now using to strengthen our university's ties with partners around the world. This, by the way, is our 10th anniversary. Please go to our website there, globalhealthcenter.umn.edu, to see all our activities. Today, I have 3 quick asks of you. First, we'll send out a survey. Please fill it up. We use that to improve our engagement activities. The second one, please consider supporting our center with a gift to the QP Fund so we may continue to provide for webinars like this and also for global health scholarships that we have created. And lastly, given the topic of today and the times, please vote. It's very important. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Bye now.